What are your thoughts then about the future of prompt engineering through Jakob's lens of we're in this maybe potentially temporary middle state of, well, first of all, let me stop there and ask you, do you think that prompt engineering is a temporary middle state?
I think so, which I think that's becoming an increasingly more controversial opinion. I've
Hmm.
talked to more and more folks recently from other companies, Google's and the like, and I was a bit surprised to hear that more and more opinions are coming out that prompt engineering is here to stay, rather than
Hmm.
prompt engineering is this sort of transient or transitory phase. Reason being is because I had a colleague from Google telling me that he was finding it more surprisingly more difficult to pull away from prompt engineering and shift to whatever other option they're working on at Google that he couldn't tell me about. And
Oh.
I
Hmm.
am also similarly surprised because I think of prompt engineering again, and this is all because my background is around thinking of language as a system. I think that because you are creating prompts using language, they inherently have structure. If you're using language, they inherently have patterns. And so if there's structure and patterns, then theoretically you can analyze that and then do something to try and make that less manual. So I like to think that Nielsen is, right about that, that's where we would go. Personally, from my perspective, I think prompt engineering is way too manual right now. And
Hmm.
in the same way that we saw this slowdown with the hype around chatbots back in around, I don't know, 2017, 2018, where people found out, oh, it's a lot more difficult because you have to create intents and train them. And and you have to do the conversation design manually, that it wasn't quite as efficient or as easy to do as people thought. In fact, it was much more expensive to do so. I wonder if we're going to get to that point when it comes to implementing generative AI soon, when it comes to creating an actual meaningful or a user experience that has utility and flow. Right now, I think that because the hype is so big and because it's new, and I think people are just craving something new in the technological field, we haven't really seen a boom like this since, you know, I don't know, the invention of the app for a smartphone. That I think that's really where the phase that we're in right now. Okay, the experience may not be great, but I think Nielsen is right. The company that's going to nail that conversational, multimodal, interactive experience, that's going to be the one that's going to set the bar and everybody will follow. But prompt engineering, right now, I think it's just too manual for that to scale. My hope is
Hmm.
that we can get to a point where prompt engineering isn't quite so manual and we can make it faster and more pattern and system driven.
What might that look like? Like what how could prompt engineering evolve into a different kind of user experience? Like it seems to me that the analogy that Jakob uses where he says, well, there used to be specially trained query specialists who can look through extensive databases of medical research, but now there's just Google. That seems to be too close a connection.
Hmm.
Whereas like prompt engineering evolving into something else feels like that's going to be a bigger leap.
I actually like that metaphor a lot because the difference I see between these sort of highly trained medical specialists and anybody using Google is the degree of specificity or register around the language you use to perform the search. So you may have to know and be very specific with the kind of language or terms that you would use as like a trained professional to look up medical records in the past. But now, because Google has solved the problem of having to know any of those terms, that anybody can perform a search, it can be very quite general and you can sort of like you said, have that turn taking and continue to refine it. I think I do have a counterpoint to this idea in Nielsen's article that there's no turn taking when it comes to, prompt based interactions, because I think that there are. I think that, conversation is all about You say one thing, the other person says something back.
Mm,
When I put in the prompt, I get an output back. And then when I say, now do X to that output, that's turn number
mm.
3. And then turn number 4 is when I get the refined output. Now, to what extent do those turns continue to persist, and does the memory hold? That part starts to degrade over time. We've seen that, like, the longer that you have a conversation with ChatGPT, the harder it is for it to remember what happened 10, 15 turns ago. That
Yeah.
said, I think that's really where the evolution would have the most potential, in terms of prompting, is that ideally you don't need these huge, massive, context laden prompts, and that you can just have this conversation with, a large language model and say, you know, I want you to write me a paragraph that, introduces me on LinkedIn to a community of developers. And then you get an output and say, now change it to be more hip because they're 20 years old. Okay. It needs to then think about what it means and what they are in the conversation.
Oh,
So, because
okay.
when we're having human conversations, we use
We get it. Yep.
exactly, because in language, the phenomenon is called anaphora. You're making a reference using a pronoun to something that happened
Aha.
earlier in the conversation. That, I think, will be the difference between a prompt engineer doing what I'm doing and an everyday person